Welcome to Nayfee Paints. In this video, I'll be showing you how I made my little diorama fish tank, depicting the mighty Imperial Fists versus the Chaos Blood Pact. This was a fun build to attempt. While not perfect, I'm pretty happy with the end result, and I'll have another go in the future. With that, let's crack in. Just going over everything I used for the build, some 3D printed models at epic scale, a couple of fish for the tank, some wiring to represent barbed wire, this empty little model train box, the Tamiya soil effect, some toothpicks, some foam, some leftover junk to use as battlefield debris, plasticard rods, and the resin I used is Tamiya clear epoxy resin. So the first step here was to paint all the miniatures. Due to these miniatures being so tiny, I like to glue them onto a toothpick using a tiny bit of super glue and push the toothpick into a bit of foam. Placing them into the foam like this just allows me to batch paint them nice and easily and makes handling these little miniatures tolerable. So for the actual fish tank itself, I've got this little empty container here. This box used to hold some model train handrails. I never throw little things like this away, as for future projects, they could always come in handy, and today it'll become a fish tank. Before carrying on with the build, I drilled a hole in the top of the box here. The reason for doing this is to fit a little pipe inside later, and also have an opening where I can pour the resin through. Drilling the hole this early in the build is just a safety precaution, just in case the plastic was to crack, it wouldn't ruin my build further down the line. With the hole being drilled and not cracking the container, I can move on now with painting the models. When painting the miniatures, I'll batch paint them all together just so I can speed up the process. The first step was to undercoat them with Vallejo's black primer. This is run through my airbrush with a little bit of Vallejo's flow improver mixed in. The base coat of the Space Marines was done with pale yellow from Vallejo. I've done this with 2 coats, just to make sure the yellow is nice and bright over the black. And for the Blood Pact, I've gone with Vermillion from Vallejo, again in 2 coats to make sure I got a nice base coat of the red. The next step is to get all the base coats down on the models. So for the face masks on the Blood Pact, I've gone with Arctic White from Vallejo. For all the metal on both the Space Marines and the Blood Pact, I've gone with Leadbelcher from Citadel. On the Space Marines, I've applied this colour to their weapons and a little bit onto their backpacks. And on the Blood Pact with this colour, I've gone with the helmets, shoulder pads, chest plates, grenades, and weapons. For all the leather areas on the Blood Pact, I've gone with Vallejo's German Camo, pale brown, and this will go on the backpacks, boots, and belts. And for the skin sections of the Blood Pact, I've gone with Bugman's Glow from Citadel. And with Vermilion Red from Vallejo, I've painted the trimming on the shoulder pads and the knee pads on the Space Marines. And I forgot to film it, but the cape on the Terminator is also painted with Arctic White from Vallejo. Now it's time to wash both the Blood Pact and the Space Marines, and I've done this with Agrax Earthshade from Citadel. This is straight out of the pot and applied just directly over the entire model. Doing this will just bring out all the tiny little details on these models. Once Agrax Earthshade dries up fully, now it's time to go back over the models and highlight them up. So for all the red areas, I've gone with Mephisto Red as the first highlight. The second highlight on the red is Squig Orange, and with the orange I've just painted a little bit less of this colour on, and these 2 colours are both from Citadel. For all the yellow areas, I've gone with straight pale yellow from Vallejo, and for a second highlight it's the same pale yellow with a little Arctic White from Vallejo mixed in. And to highlight the cloth on the Terminator, I've gone with straight Arctic White. The silver areas are highlighted with Citadel's Leadbelcher. To highlight the leathers, I've gone back to Vallejo's German Camo pale brown, and to lighten up the colour a little bit, I've mixed in a tiny bit of Vallejo's Bonewhite. And for the flesh, I've gone with straight Bugman's Glow from Citadel. With all the highlights being done, now it's time to do the Space Marine's eye lenses and add a glow effect to both his plasma pistol and power sword. On a normal 28mm model, I'd usually put down a coat of white first and then apply the Tesseract glow over the top, but these models are so tiny, I can get away with just applying Tesseract glow straight from the pot. So that's what I've gone with. It's just Tesseract glow from Citadel and it's straight into these areas. And it's applied with 2 coats, waiting for the first to dry before applying the second. That's the Imperial Fists and Blood Pact done. Now it's time to move on to the fish. So onto the fish, I've gone with oil paints as their base coats, as I wanted the blending to be nice and simple, and using oils will achieve this. In hindsight, I should have stuck to the acrylic paints, as the oils caused some drama down the line. Just like the other miniatures, the fish were undercoated with the black. Before painting, I've ran Model Air White from Vallejo through the airbrush and given them a coat of this colour. This lightens up the models nicely and allows me to paint the oils over the top without any issue. So this first colour here is Azo Red Medium from Van Gogh. I applied this paint to the entire model except the tips of the fins. And with the white areas exposed, I've gone over these with Cerulean Blue Phthalo from Van Gogh. This is applied while the red paint is still wet. When applying the blue, I'm not too worried if it goes on the red, as I'm going to blend the 2 colours together in the next step. Once I got the blue down, I then just start to blend the 2 colours together, getting this like purplish colour. I take my time blending back and forth between the 2 colours, adding a little bit of blue or a little bit of red where needed. Nothing too spectacular, but it does the job for what I want. Once I was happy with the blends, I left the fish to dry for a couple of days. Once those oils had dried, I sealed them in with the Army Painter's Anti-Shine Matte Varnish. This was just to protect the oil paints and just to make sure they weren't going to smudge in the future. And as we'll see later, this did not work, and lesson learned on this project. With the oils dry and the Anti-Shine Matte Varnish applied, I've then given the models a wash with Caribou Crimson from Citadel. Applying this purple wash is just to bring out the detail of the fish a bit better. This next step here is adding highlights to the fish, and with the highlights just picking out the edges and details of the models. So for the blue areas I've gone with Caledor Sky from Citadel, and the red I've gone with this Squig Orange, also from Citadel. To do the eyes of the fish is super simple, it's just matte black from the Army Painter. And with the eyes painted in, the fish are done. With everything painted, now it's time to start building the fish tank. So for the base of the tank, I want to build it out a little bit and add some legs to it. The first thing to do is put down 4 pieces of square plasticard on the bottom side of the tank. I glue these into position with some super glue. Any excess I cut away with my clippers and hobby knife. Then I just measure and cut myself 4 equal lengths of the plasticard, and these will form the legs, and I'll just butt these up into the corners and glue them down with some super glue. Adding the legs gets the tank off the floor and adds a little bit of visual interest. With the legs in position, now it's time to dry fit the miniatures onto the table. So when I glued them to the sticks, I used a tiny amount of super glue, so I just carefully pop these off the sticks, cut away any excess super glue they might have stuck onto their base, and then with a bit of blue tack, just stick them into position until I was happy with the setup. I then took a photo of the positioning of the models, as after I lay the terrain down, I'll place these back into the same spot. For the fish, I'll just be sticking them to a spare spot on the glass, and just making sure they don't block any line of sight to any of the models. To make the pipe inside the tank, I just got myself some round plasticard rod, measured and cut this to size. And the edges on the sides and the top of the tank, I've gone with L-shaped plasticard rods. Once these are painted and glued into position, these will represent the metal frame of the tank. I've undercoated all these pieces with Vallejo's black primer, getting them ready for paint. With that primed, it's ready for paint, and the first colour here is Leadbelcher from Citadel. This next colour here is flat brown from Vallejo. Using one of my older brushes here, as I don't want to wreck one of my new ones. I'm applying this paint to random areas, and even use my finger just to smudge it out a little bit. This will form the base coat for my rust, so I don't want it to look uniform when applying this paint. Now it's time to apply a wash, and this is done with Oiled Earth from Vallejo. With the wash dried, now it's time to really get the rust going. This is done with Rust Texture from Vallejo, trying to target the parts of the brown where I hit earlier. Also, when applying this paint, I like to do it in 3 different steps. Applying it straight from the pot, with a little water mixed in, and then a lot of water mixed into it. Mixing water into the paint like this will give me varying results at the end. And the final paint to apply to the metal is Rust from Vallejo. And like the previous colour, I apply this paint randomly with varying amounts of water mixed into the paint. Here I've applied the Tamiya soil effect to the inside of the tank. Unfortunately when filming, the video didn't focus and it was just a blurry mess. So nothing too special, just take a little spatula applied with the Tamiya soil effect, apply it to the base and just smooth it out a little bit. For the terrain inside the tank, I've gone with 2 small pieces. The first is a little train line, and the second is a piece of battlefield barbed wire. The rail line is cut out from a piece of garden grating I had left over. And to make the barbed wire, I had these 2 small pieces of electrical wire that were already wrapped together. To make the circles nice and small, I wrap them around the top of the tweezers. Once you pop it off and paint it, you get a nice little piece of barbed wire. When it comes to painting them, I've done them super simply. The first step is undercoating them with Vallejo's black. Step number 2 is applying a coat of Leadbelcher from Citadel, and they're done. The soil effect takes a couple hours to dry, so here it's still wet. So I'll take the 2 pieces of terrain, just push them down into the soil effect. Doing this, just make sure they're in the right position and they look okay. Once I was happy with the positioning, I used some super glue to glue them down. Now with the models, I don't need to dry fit these, as earlier I took that photo. So I used it as reference to reposition all the models where they were. So I just pick up the models with a pair of tweezers carefully, place a little super glue on the model, and then push this down into position. Because some of these models have little bases attached to their feet, I want to cover these over too. So I just used a bit of the soil effect and carefully go between their legs, covering over the bases. Once that's done, I leave it to dry overnight. The last thing to do was add a few little bushes into the terrain piece, just to give it a bit of colour and break up all the brown. So I've used a couple of these little shrubs from Gale Force 9. To glue these on, I just dip them down into some PVA glue, and then just put these into position on the board. And leave that for another 24 hours to make sure the PVA glue is fully dried. Now it's time to put the lid back on, just make sure it fits nice and tight. Any of the sand that might be in the little groove here, I just cleaned away with my hobby knife. When I was cleaning away some of the sand, it chipped off a little bit of the paint. Before gluing anything down, I just went back in with my paintbrush and fixed up these little nicks. Once I'm satisfied that the lid is nice and tight, I now glue the fish into position using a tiny bit of super glue. Now it's time to glue the lid down. So I apply a little bit of PVA glue around the edges, just enough so when it hardens, it'll lock it into position. Just to prevent any leaking out of the sides of the tank, I've got some electrical tape here. I run this around the model a few times. On each of the edges, I make sure I pull it nice and tight, but not too tight as to crack the plastic. Now it's time for my resin pour. Before mixing or pouring any resin, make sure you thoroughly read the instructions, as the resins have different mixes to each other. This one is a 2-to-1 mix of the resin and hardener. I've worked out how much resin I roughly need, and using my scales here, I've just weighed this up. Put my 2 halves of my resin in, and then mix it together. And for a bit of colour, I've put in a couple of drops of Bluetone from the Amyu painter. And for about 5 minutes, I slowly mix this together, just to try and avoid any air bubbles. Of course, in the video, this is sped up a couple of 100 times speed, as watching me mix this for 5 minutes would be bloody boring. So to pour the resin in, I've taken out the pipe first, filled up the entire tank with the resin, leaving a little bit of space at the top, and then pushed the pipe in. And then crossed my fingers, I didn't get too many air bubbles, and it wasn't a total disaster. When this resin hardens, it starts to get hot, and I don't know why, it doesn't affect the acrylic paints, but the oil paints on the fish, it started to separate the oils. I got kind of this cool effect where the paint lifted off and the fish looks like misty. Because the paint was lifting off, I did lose the detail on the paint job on the fish, but lesson learned for next time, you get faster blends with oil paints, but acrylics you'll get better results in the end. The next step was to glue all the bracketing on the tank. The 4 vertical pieces I'd painted earlier, so I glue those down now. I wasn't sure what I was going to put at the top, so I left it till last. So in the end, I just built myself a little fish tank pump out of random junk. Once this was built, I then measured all my horizontal bracketing up. I then dry fitted this all down, making sure it fits together. Once I was happy with the fit, I painted this like the rest of the metal on the tank, and using a tiny bit of super glue on each section, I glued this all into position. For a little extra detail, I glued down these 3D printed candles I had sitting in my bits box. Adding these to the top of the tank was just to add some colour and visual interest. So using some white spirits on a Q-tip, I carefully just went around wiping off any excess resin and fingerprints off the glass window. Now it's time to add some slime to the glass and the metal of the tank. And this is done with Vallejo's Slimy Grime Light and Slimy Grime Dark. And with these 2 paints, I just go around putting a little bit on the glass and around the metal, just to show some moisture might be building up over time and leaving some mold and mildew behind. And with that, one of my most challenging, yet smallest projects is finally done. Thanks for watching Nayfee Paints. If you liked the video, please click the sub button or leave me a like, and I'll see you in the next one. Catch ya.